Kat and Michelle. How are you today? Let's start with a blessing here. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'kivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah. So, before we plunge back into Leviticus 26 and the never-ending curses, how did everybody do with the BeliefNet quiz? Anybody want to tell us, Belief-O-Matic, what that was like for you? Were you surprised by the results?
It was harder than I expected. It was like some of them were so close that I had to think about it. I'm not super surprised, but I was neo-pagan. I mean, I'm not really like a tribal, but I'm more Kabbalistic and into nature, and because of that, it really didn't surprise me. But I don't do the heathen Wiccan thing. It's not, at least not yet. But it was interesting. It was fun. But it was, I said, it was harder than I thought it was going to be, because there's also is it high, medium, or low importance, and some of the answers were close. It was one thing I want. Are there any explanations of the religions anywhere there? I didn't really look.
I would imagine so, but I haven't explored for that.
So I thought that was the only pagan.
I thought the questions reflected the Christian basis of BeliefNet, because a lot of them simply were phrased in a way that wouldn't be, there wasn't a neutrality of phrasing. It was a very Christian phrasing of a lot of the questions.
Thank you, Becca. I was wondering, I thought it was probably a Christian group that was.
Yeah, I had noticed that too. I was like, this is very slanted one way.
Yeah.
I thought it was easy enough, though, to rule out which ones they were pretty quick. Like, I mean, if they say one God in 3 forms, that's not one of the ones that we were going to really look at and say yes. Or at least I wasn't.
But I wonder for non-Jews and non-Christians, I would think that some of those questions were really alienating.
Well, I got neo-pagan.
So. The neo-pagans.
Well, I will say that I shared it with one of my neighbors who is, well, she responded, she was very interested in, she responded, she said, not surprisingly, I came out conservative Christian evangelical. And she said, right on.
There you go. Sarah Lee, you've been trying to get in, yeah?
Yes, just on a different note, and I'm not sure where I got this from, but I've come from Temple High. But this is the blessing for the mitzvah of putting on a mask.
Oh, yes, I've seen that.
Have you seen that one?
Yeah.
It is, the English part of it is so beautiful, because it says, blessed are you, eternal our God, sovereign of the world, who has sanctified us with the commandments and commanded us to protect life.
Yeah, when I translate, I try to avoid the word sanctify. That's a translation of Asher Kiddushanu. Kadosh is holy. So Asher Kiddushanu. I much prefer the translation, who has made us holy, rather than who has sanctified us. I feel like it's just much more accessible. And one of the interesting things I learned from my teacher, Reb Zalman, was he said, if you're translating from Hebrew into English and you have a choice between a word that has a Latin root or a word that has a German root, you should always go with the word that has a German root, because it will be warmer and homier and more down to earth. So this is an example. Kadosh, holy, could come from the Latin sanctus or from the German Heilige. So who makes us holy or who sanctifies us. And if you think about the difference between those, I just, it's a personal preference, but I'm always, when we're developing slides for the temple and we have to translate, I'm constantly correcting sanctified into who makes us holy. So that's just my my critique of that blessing. I think it's lovely that somebody thought to write that blessing, and I like the concept of it, but I would have just translated it slightly differently. Other thoughts on your newfound religion?
I came out as a Quaker, which I find problematic because I do not like oatmeal.
Kat, you have a kindred
Becca,
spirit.
ditto.
All right, good. Well, I hope you had fun with that. We are in Leviticus chapter 29, chapter 26, verse 29. And we've seen this repetition. If you continue to disobey, if you continue to disobey, and the punishment will be sevenfold. And now we're up to this verse 29. You will eat the flesh of your sons and of your daughters. You will eat them. So it's the verb to eat is repeated. It's interesting that both the sons and the daughters are mentioned very often. You know, the masculine serves as also the generic for male and female. So I think it's really emphasizing the horror of this curse to mention both the sons and the daughters. You'd think that maybe the daughters would be spared, that there would be some sensitivity to the daughters. If you think about Pharaoh only drowned the male children, the female children were spared. But here, the boys and the girls are both specifically mentioned. Yeah, Lisa?
So I forget what I was watching, something on the Smithsonian Channel or something. And so these archaeologists had excavated a really ancient tomb of a pharaoh, and on the wall was a depiction of a time of famine. The Nile hadn't flooded, and there was a big famine, and the illustration on the wall was exactly that, of the Egyptians eating their children.
Well,
so so I'm making that connection between what's written here and so maybe that was the experience of the Israelites. They had seen that in Egypt at time of famine.
So the book of Lamentations, Echa, which we read on Tisha B'Av, is a firsthand account of the destruction of Jerusalem and the terrible trauma of that. And in the chapter 2 of Echa, beginning with verse 19, arise, cry out in the night, in the beginning of the watches, pour out thy heart like water before the face of the Lord. Lift up thy hands towards him for the life of thy young children that faint for hunger at the head of every street. Behold, O Lord, and consider to whom thou hast done this. Shall the women eat their fruit, their cherished babies? Shall priest and prophet be slain in the street? It continues from there. But, it does describe the actual implementation of this curse that we're reading about in theory right here. I wanted to also go back. We looked last week at the Women's Torah commentary. I think, Marcy, you have that one, right? Is that what you're working from?
Yes.
Do you mind being our reader again? So you're on page 770.
I will do my best.
Thanks.
Where am I at?
Verse 29 at the bottom of the page, and it continues on to 771. And you all have access to this. It was in the handouts that Robin put online for us.
Should I give everyone a second to find it?
No, if you just read, and if
Okay.
they want to find it, they'll have it.
Okay. You shall eat the flesh of your sons and the flesh of your daughters. The horrific prospect of cannibalism as a result of siege, extreme famine, or both is a recurrent theme in Israelite and other ancient Near Eastern curses. An extreme version of this theme appears in 2 Kings 6, verses 28 and 29, When a king is besieged and famine-struck, Samaria must decide between two women who had agreed to eat their respective children, first one and then the other, to stave off starvation. A conflict erupts when, after having shared in eating the first woman's child, the second mother hides her son. In parentheses, the story is an ironic twist on the episode in which King Solomon demonstrates his superb wisdom by determining which harlot is the rightful mother of a baby. See 1 Kings 3 verses 16 to 28, close parentheses. In Lamentations 2 verse 20 and 4 verse 10, references to women desperate enough to eat their own children show how terrible the situation for the people of Judah has become. In both of these texts, the image of women eating their children exemplifies a crisis so severe that reverses even the maternal instinct. Instead of being willing to sacrifice everything, even themselves, for their children, these mothers sacrifice their children in the most horrific way possible so that they may live. The image is that of a world turned tragically upside down by the horrors of wartime siege and famine. And hopefully we won't come to that in this horrible time.
Yeah, well, you know, that's one of the blessings we started off with when we were schmoozing about all of the items that were difficult to acquire, especially in March. But we may not have been able to acquire the specific items that we wanted, but none of us was going to starve for want of food.
Is that where you want me to end, or should I continue with?
Yeah, no, we'll look at the next one in a minute. I just wanted
Okay.
to look at this, and then I have a note. Talk among yourselves, and then I have to find one more book in my box.
Hi, Sharon.
Hi, Marcy.
Since we're talking amongst ourselves, I just wanted to say good morning.
Yeah, thank you. That's very sweet. You were very kind in the other, in Rabbi Burke's.
Oh, well, you're welcome. I mean, I was thrilled to see you.
Thank you. That was nice. It was thrilling to be there and see him and you and everyone else.
Yeah, it was interesting. I don't remember who else from here was there.
I don't either.
I'm going to try and be there this week as well.
Is it the same D?
I think so. I'm not sure.
So I just wrote my note wrong. I wrote Hoffman instead of Friedman, but I'm in the Friedman. Becca, you have this one?
Yeah, I've got it.
Yeah.
You want me to read it?
Would you read on page 411, please?
Yeah, I was looking at it. It's a little dense. Okay. The verse, you will eat your son's flesh and your daughter's flesh. The blessings and curses are not rewards and punishments. They are a formal part of the biblical covenants, Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, with exact parallels in legal contracts of the ancient Near East. They express the outcomes of fulfillment or non-fulfillment of the covenant's terms. A people who is faithful to its God and keeps the Sabbath and honors its parents and does not steal will be prosperous and enduring in its land. A people who loses sight of its commitments and values will suffer. It should not be hard to think of contemporary parallels. The frightful curse of eating one's own children comes true centuries later in one of the most horrifying stories in the Bible, 2 Kings
the one
6:24 to 30. Yeah, the one you just mentioned. It is not presented there as a punishment. It rather conveys the terrible state of things in Israel in the wake of the heretical reigns of Kings Ahab and Jehoram. There is a big difference between a punishment and a curse, between a threat and a warning. This explanation is still distressing, but it does not so easily picture the deity as malicious, as people have sometimes taken these curses to mean. The God of the Hebrew Bible is not the Old Testament God of wrath, but rather a deity who is torn between mercy and justice, between affection for humankind and regret over the continuous conflict with them. The curses are a sad outcome of a certain kind of human behavior. but then the blessings are the outcome of the other kind.
So do you agree with this distinction between a punishment and a curse?
It seems like a very legalistic semantic difference.
And I'm thinking back to I guess it was Heimgenot and natural consequences. So it's natural consequences of all the behaviors.
To predict difference, it's a time-bound difference. It's the difference between a prediction and the thing happening.
Yeah.
Say more about that.
Well, if I say, if you take that cookie, I'm going to spank you, child development terms, and then the kid takes the cookie and you spank him, you're acting on a prediction that you said was going to happen. When you said it, it wasn't a punishment. It was predicting a punishment, but predicting a bad outcome.
And what's the parallel example of a curse?
That is, for sure, if you take that, that's what's going to happen. All children who steal cookies will be punished. Maybe maybe off the point, but it makes sense to me.
Oh, okay.
It does make sense. I have a little bit of a different angle on it. It seems very difficult for me, but I think what I see as the main difference is that in a curse, we experience a devolution, whereas in a punishment, we maintain our status as involved and civilized, but we are hurt as a consequence of our actions. To eat your children has to me symbolize a regression back to animalism and away from humanism.
So
devolution in that sense.
So the curse is almost extrajudicial, whereas the punishment is still in the context of a civilized judicial system.
Yes.
I actually went to Google Dictionary to see what the distinction was, and punishment is the infliction of or imposition of a penalty as retribution for an offense. But I'm going to have to paraphrase it. A curse invokes the supernatural.
All right, Sharon, what were you going to say?
Well, this might be oversimplifying it, but to me, a punishment is cause and effect in the present, whereas a curse is cause and effect forever. A curse is not just for this cookie, but any other cookies and anything else.
So the question is, can a curse be undone? According to Friedman's analysis, this situation is the direct outcome of our non-fulfillment of God's desire for how we should live our lives. So if we change our behavior, then that should mitigate the effect of the curse, which is in fact what we see in the prophets. You know, the prophets, we have this tension between rebuke and consolation. You know, if you keep doing this, you're going to be punished, you're going to be punished. And in fact, the temple is destroyed, the people are exiled. Many of these negative consequences do emerge, but then there is still the opportunity for Teshuva. You know, this idea of a curse for all time seems to remove any concept of Teshuva, that we can repent, change, and then alleviate the curse. So I'd like to be a little more optimistic than to think that these curses are once applied, that there's no way out.
That they're cookies in the future.
Yeah, right, exactly. I'm pro cookies in the future. All right, so let's.
I don't allow cookies on my computer.
I don't allow cookies in my body either, but I like the possibility of cookies.
Keep it open.
Yep. Verse 30, somebody want to read verse 30 for us? We're back in the text.
Oh, I've
Okay.
got it.
Yeah.
Okay. I will destroy your lofty buildings and decimate your sun idols. I will cast your carcasses upon the carcasses of your idols, and my spirit will reject you.
Wow, that's an interesting translation.
Yeah, that's some stone.
Uh-huh. Yeah. The Hebrew is v'hishmadati et bamotechem. I will destroy your bimas. You know, it's the same word that we use for the platform in the temple, the bima. I'll destroy your bimas. So how did Stone translate that?
Lofty buildings.
Well, okay, you know, I guess.
No, but bimas gets so much more personal to their religious practice that, you know, there's a fault in how you are worshiping and behaving. So we're going to hit you. I'm going to hit you right there because you're not being true to it. You know, so I like the bimas part better. Lofty buildings is, you know, sort of a good sci-fi movie where the skyscrapers come down.
Yeah, the Eitz Chaim has cult places, as does the Women's Torah Commentary. I'll destroy your cult places.
I have yet another version of the Steinsaltz edition.
Uh-huh.
I have something that says, and cut down your incense stands.
Yeah.
And I will heap your carcasses upon your lifeless fetishes.
Yeah, that's the JPS translation. I have that here, but it's that was Sarah Lee. Sarah Lee, go back right before incense stands. We're looking at, I will destroy your cult places and cut down your incense.
Yeah, I will destroy your cult places and cut down your incense stands, and I will heap your carcasses upon your lifeless fetishes.
And Owen, what does Steinsaltz say?
I will destroy your high places and destroy your sun idols.
Yes.
And I shall cast your carcasses on the carcasses of your idols, and my soul shall reject you.
Yeah.
And that's very close to the Stone translation too.
Yeah.
And Friedman as well. Friedman's similar.
Yeah.
So however we understand it, it's clearly a destruction of places of idolatrous worship.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting that in effect we have God saying, my soul will scorn you. I don't know how often we've heard God refer to her soul.
Right. And the word is nafshi, my nefesh. So it's it's a very poignant image. This idea of God having a soul. So this is I wanted to look at the Women's Torah Commentary on this one as well. So Marcy, I think sadly you're the only one who has that, if you don't mind.
Sure. All right. Biblical references use neutral terms for cult places, sometimes translated as high places, or local shrines in early stages of Israelite life, but criticize these for the period after the building of the temple in Jerusalem in the 10th or 9th century BCE.
So you get that? It's there's no judgment about the term when it's used in the earlier text, and then it comes to have a negative connotation. Yeah.
For example, 1 Kings 22 verse 44 and 2 Kings 15 verse 35 mention people worshiping God at such high places. That author does not approve of the practice, yet apparently tolerates it. More so than men, women most likely depended on local shrines to enable them to participate in communal events. Parentheses, they probably also had home shrines, close parentheses.
Right, so this is the Women's Torah Commentary, so it's specifically looking at the role of women and the impact of whatever the text has to say on the lives of women of that era. So women would have less opportunity to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem because, you know, in a pre-modern era, they, you know, they're having, you know, 10, 12, 15 children, that, you know, packing all those kids up in the household and nursing infants and walking or riding to Jerusalem was not realistic. So the authors are suggesting that these bamot, these high places, were more important for the religious life of women.
You going?
Please.
Okay. The Bible, and probably the Israelites in general, apparently considered worship of God at these local shrines to be a legitimate religious outlet until centralization of worship at the temple began to be enforced. See Deuteronomy 12, verses 2 to 14. The Bible suggests that this centralization began around the 7th century BCE in the reigns of King Hezekiah and later Josiah.
Right. So just stop there for 1 second. So you remember that Hezekiah and Josiah were two of the good guys who cleaned up the temple and the religious practice, which had become syncretized with idolatrous practices brought in, blamed on the foreign wives that the kings would acquire, and then they would institute these foreign religious practices that were melded with the Jewish religious practice. And Josiah famously was cleaning up the temple in the year 622. They found the text of Deuteronomy. So the text of Deuteronomy had been lost until the year 622, which, you know, here it says right there around the 7th century. So when they found Deuteronomy, all of a sudden they opened up Deuteronomy and it talks about centralizing worship in one place in Jerusalem and eliminating all of these local shtiblach that were all around in the community. And so that's what the text is referring to here. That so at that time that they began to take down these local shrines that had become polluted with other religious practices and bring all of the worship back under a central authority where obviously there could be more control. Okay, Marcy.
Okay. The Bible, the Bible associates worship at local shrines after that time with idolatry, regardless of who was worshipped there. Centralization of worship probably had a huge impact on women, who would have been less able than men were to leave their families and their domestic and reproductive responsibilities in order to travel to Jerusalem, which is what you just said. Once the worship of God at local shrines ceased to be legitimate, women lost important communal religious practices. When the Bible mentions women's worship from the period of the monarchy on, it mostly categorizes it as worship of false deities, probably considered noteworthy because such practices undermine the central sanctuary. See, for example, the association of women with worship of Asherah, and gives a bunch of references. Want me to read those?
No, that's okay.
Okay. References to female worship of the Queen of Heaven and women weeping for Tammuz. From an Israelite woman's perspective, many of these practices were probably traditional and legitimate. See women's defense of the worship in Jeremiah 44.
So yeah, anybody who wants to look up those references can find the document on our URL and go back into the Tanakh and look up all those specific instances. But I just thought it was interesting to see the disproportionate impact of the elimination of local places of worship in the lives of women versus men. All right, we're going back to the text. We are, God's soul rejected us, and now we're on verse 31. So can somebody continue reading for us in the Torah?
Sure, I will. And I shall make your cities a ruin, and I shall devastate your holy places, and I shall not smell your pleasant smell.
Meaning the smell of the sacrificial offerings, not the perfume of our bodies.
Shall I go on?
Please.
And I shall devastate the land, so your enemies who live in it will be astonished. And you, I shall scatter among the nations, and I shall unsheath my sword after you. And your land will be a devastation, and your cities will be a ruin.
Wow. So again, would you read us Hoffman's comment, Friedman's comment on page 413?
Let me catch up with you. Okay. 413, their crime and their father's crime? No, you mean the page before.
412.
26. Yeah. Okay. So starting with 2631, not smell your pleasant smell. The pleasant smell has been referred to many times as the product of the burning incense that accompanies the sacrifices. Starting with Noah's sacrifice after the flood, the smell of sacrifices is meant to be attractive to the deity, but the curse here is that God will refuse to smell it. And then going on, 2633, scatter among the nations. Among the worst curses was the curse of exile, for a people to be driven off their land and scattered around the world. This possibility was a reality in the ancient Near East, where exile was a horrifying fate. This curse would come to pass for Israel later in the Tanakh, when they would come to know exile at the hands of the Assyrians. And it would come to pass for Judah still later at the hands of the Babylonians. But they would also come to know the blessing of return. And then 2633, unsheath my sword. To appreciate the horror of the metaphor of God saying he will go after Israel unsheathing a sword, one should recall that this is exactly what the Egyptians say they will do to Israel in the Song of the Sea, Exodus 15:9. That is, God, who is Israel's protector, threatens a curse in which God would become like Israel's enemies. It is one's worst nightmare that one's loving, protecting parents become a horrible threat.
So a couple of interesting ideas that emerge there. One is the curse of exile. Beck, I was thinking about you and how you're always reminding us of the importance of community, being connected to community, and how terrible it is to be cut off from a sense of community. On the other hand, I think an argument can be made that the Jewish people, Judaism, has been saved by exile because, it's sort of like, when Jacob was about to be reunited with his brother Esau, and he was so concerned about how he would be received. So one of the things that he does is divide his camp up so that if one is attacked and destroyed, at least some of his family would survive. You can look at the whole Jewish people in that way, that a positive or a silver lining of exile is that as the Jewish community spread out around the world, yes, it may have been more challenging to sustain Jewish life in these far-flung corners, but it did ensure that even if one Jewish community was destroyed, others would survive. So I think exile is both a blessing and a curse, even though here it's depicted as fully a curse. And here we're having this conversation in Arizona, which many people would consider to be in exile. We're not only are we not in Israel, we're not in New York or LA or Chicago, where there's a big Jewish community. And of course, with my daughter moving to Neenah, Wisconsin, that's one of my biggest fears, is that it's the diaspora of the diaspora of the diaspora. So I think it begs the question of how do we sustain Jewish life in a smaller Jewish community that's disconnected from the major resources that you find when people have just a larger community together.
Rabbi, when a community is sent into exile, it also forces both the leadership and the members of that community to become creative, because they've lost their context, they've lost their foundational basis, and they're going to have to probably do some reinvention in a new context. They're probably going to have to, they're certainly going to have to ward off all the temptations that surround them if their new context is potentially more attractive. And so I can see where exile is an enforced effort at strengthening your beliefs and strengthening your connections, your links.
Well, and scholars do speculate that the origin of the institution of the synagogue came during the Babylonian exile, because we've seen that the religious life was centered on the temple in Jerusalem. So this is, again, the negative aspect. If you put all your marbles in that one temple, and the religious life is offering sacrifices at that temple, and you eliminate the possibility of offering sacrifices at any of these local altars, it's like, putting, all your bets on that one hand, and, that you lose that hand, boom, now what? The temple is gone. We can no longer offer sacrifices. We're in Babylon with not only no access to the temple, but the temple doesn't even exist anymore. So that, scholars suggest, is when Jews began to meet together and study and prayer became the primary Jewish modalities of worship rather than offering sacrifices. So exactly as you say, it forced that those creative alternatives. And then, I was thinking, this business of unsheathing my sword against you, and the contradiction of God, who is supposed to be the protector, becoming the destroyer. Reading that on Father's Day is, it does bring home the fact of, how truly awful it is when parents who are supposed to be the primary protectors and love their children unconditionally end up abusing children. And it's, I think, part of why, that's so especially repulsive to us, because we just, it's sort of the parallel to what we saw with the mothers eating the children. That's, you imagine that mothers would rather starve themselves and feed their children rather than vice versa.
The Israelites must have been an incredibly anxiety-prone group, because they're being told God is your protector, God loves you, God is going to grant to you all these great things, until God doesn't do that, at which point God will then unsheath his mighty sword and you're done. So, I mean, they all really needed some, meds for anxiety.
Yeah, it's interesting because, there is a certain prevalence of forms of mental illness in the Jewish population. And we may be seeing the roots of that here. That anxiety and depression. I think there is a statistically significant instance of mental instability among Jews. I don't know if our psychologists have ever formally looked into that.
I don't know that. Felix, what do you think?
Well, as I think about it, I've never come across anything that distinguishes Jews as having more of a certain kind of psychopathology than other groups.
Me either.
Although there is some folklore about it, of course,
yeah,
especially related to guilt. But even there, the joke is that the Jews invented guilt, but the Catholics perfected it.
All right, so we are moving forward then, verses 34 through, we're going to read 34 to 36. It's the next little section here. Who has not had a chance to read yet? Okay, Willa, thank you.
Then shall the land make up for its Sabbath years throughout the time that it is desolate, and you are in the land of your enemies. Then shall the land rest and make up for its Sabbath years.
So you remember that the whole context of the chapters leading up to here were about the sabbatical year. So the suggestion is that this is a punishment. If you refuse to stop and have a sabbatical year, I'll show you what it means to have everything shut down. It's kind of very parallel to our contemporary situation here with the quarantine. You know, we've created a society that is go, go, go 24/7 with no rest and no opportunities for reflection. And guess what? Now that virus has enforced it all for us. So yeah, you didn't allow the land to rest. Now it's going to be enforced.
Throughout the time that it is desolate, it shall observe the test that it did not. It shall observe the rest. Oh, throughout the time that it is desolate, it shall observe the rest that it did not observe in your Sabbath years while you were dwelling upon it. Well, that's the virus, right?
Right.
So, as for those of you who survive, I will cast a faintness into their hearts in the land of their enemies. The sound of a driven leaf shall put them into flight. Fleeing as though from the sword, they shall fall through none, though none pursues.
Right. So, you know, that's that anxiety that we're talking about. That the sense of anxiety and fear will become so ingrained that even when there's no reason to be afraid, you still won't have peace and rest because you'll think somebody's out to get you even when they're not. Who has read Milton Steinberg's novel, As a Driven Leaf? Nobody?
I have it. I haven't finished it though.
You started it?
Yeah.
So did it not capture your attention that you haven't finished it, or?
Oh no, I just haven't had time. So.
Okay. So
I'm like a third of the way through.
I haven't read it in, you know, probably 40 or 50 years. So it's been a while, but my memory of it was that it was just a wonderful, wonderful book that it's set in the Talmudic period. Do I remember that correctly?
Yeah.
So it's a wonderful book. He's a great writer, Milton Steinberg. And, you know, clearly the title of the book is chosen from this verse, As a Driven Leaf. And it's a novel, but because it's set in the time of the Talmud, it really gives you a feel for that era. So highly, highly recommended. Well, if you're looking for something good to read while you have a little extra time on your hands, Milton Steinberg. I'll write it down here for you. David, how are you? Happy Father's Day.
Thank you very much, and I'm doing fine.
Good. Did you have a chance to look at that pages from Brown Driver Briggs where I gave you the sources of that route that we were looking at last week, Kerry?
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Okay, yeah, good. That was especially for you. I was able to get to the temple.
I do appreciate that.
And get that scanned for you. So what a terrible thing to just be anxious and unsettled and not be able to rest. You know, it's one thing that when those feelings are natural and appropriate, when there actually is an enemy out to get you. But I guess it's kind of a post-traumatic stress that's being described here. I think that's what they're experiencing. You know, they had this real life disaster, and now they've internalized that to the point where they can no longer let go. And post-traumatic stress is notoriously difficult to treat. With no one pursuing, they shall stumble over one another as before the sword. You shall not be able to stand your ground before your enemies, but shall perish among the nations, and the land of your enemies shall consume you. And that's again what happened with the 10 lost tribes. The land of the enemies did in fact consume most of the population. We read a reference earlier in one of the commentaries to Israel, which was the 10 northern tribes. They were destroyed in 722 BCE by the Assyrians, and that was the end. They in fact exactly what happened. The land of the enemies ate them up. Those tribes disappeared. It was only the southern kingdom of Judea that survived to form what we now know as the Jewish community today. Somehow those tribes were able to sustain a Jewish identity through the exile. Although I saw a documentary years and years ago on the search for the 10 lost tribes, and it hypothesized this route through Asia, where there are these little into India, these little pockets of communities that no longer have any kind of Jewish identity, but have, very quirky, unique practices that seem to have their roots in biblical practice. So no connection of a sense of that we were once Jewish and so we are still observing this, like you might find with the Samaritans, but just very, very random little pockets of Jewish practice. Yes, Owen.
Arthur Kessler wrote a novel about a part of Central Asia that has a Jewish population that nobody can explain, called the 13th tribe, and those are the Khazars. Now, it's a myth, presumably, but it's a myth that has some traction. Let me go find the book, make sure I'm referring to it correctly.
Yeah, and I'll see if I can find more information about that documentary, because it was truly fascinating. All right, good. So moving on, we're in verse 39. Those of you who survive shall be heartsick over their iniquity in the land of your enemies. More, that they shall be heartsick over the iniquity of their fathers. So that's so you'll finally do Teshuva. You'll finally feel bad about your wrong and the iniquities of their fathers. Again, it's sad reading this on Father's Day. We like to think that on Father's Day we're looking at all the great wise lessons of our fathers and appreciating all of the wonderful values and teachings that they transmitted to us. And imagine this text is asking us to imagine just the opposite, that instead of feeling proud about who our fathers are, we feel heartsick is the translation here. Heartsick about.
Rabbi, interesting in stone. It totally sounds different. Because of their iniquity, your remnant will disintegrate in the lands of your foes, and because the iniquities of their forefathers, and not your forefathers, their forefathers, are with them as well, they will disintegrate. Yes, that sounds so different than the other translation.
Friedman uses the word rot. They will rot for their crime.
Mm. So, and they shall confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers, in that they trespassed against me, yea, were hostile to me. So confession. So this is the stages of Teshuva. The first stage of Teshuva is recognizing that you've done wrong The second stage is verbal confession. You know, this is still part of the process of Teshuva as we have it incorporated into our Yom Kippur liturgy. Ashamnu, Bagadnu, Gazalnu, Dibarnu, Dofi, right? Verbal confession, both in that kind of public setting or even in the individual interpersonal processes of repentance and reconciliation. The first part is recognizing and acknowledging and articulating what we did wrong. You know, the 5 languages of apology that we've talked about before. So for many people, that sense of regret and remorse is an important part of an apology. People want to know that, you know, not just I'm sorry, but I'm sorry that I did A, B, C, and that it caused you to feel X, Y, Z. So verbal confession. So they will confess their iniquity. This business of confessing the iniquity of parents or previous generations. Gosh, I was going to totally take issue with that. And yet, you know, if you look at what's going on in our country right now with institutional racism, you know, maybe that's part of the process of what we're going through is the iniquity of our ancestors and coming to terms with that. At first I thought, like, how can I be held responsible for the wrongdoing of my parents? Why should I have to confess the wrongdoing of my parents? And yet it does seem to be an important aspect of any movement towards reconciliation for us as an American community right now, that we recognize that what we're calling here sins of the fathers, we could call institutional racism, institutional wrongdoing. So maybe there is some role for that, and even if we are not directly the wrongdoers, to recognize that wrong has been done.
Does it have something to do with the fact that we don't necessarily recognize in ourselves that we are possibly reflecting in our behavior, in our actions, things that are that we gained from our fathers and mothers? In other words, I'm not coming up with the right words for it, but does our behavior unwittingly, unintentionally show that we were raised in a home where unkind words were spoken about people of a different race or creed or religion or whatever, and that as compassionate adults, perhaps we need to be doing an inventory of ourselves every once in a while. How did I come to believe this? How did I come to act in this certain way? Was it in fact something that I inherited? So maybe there's an element of this self-inventory.
Yes, and you know, that's a traditional way of making peace with and understanding the idea of the sins of the parents being visited on the children, that for better or worse, we are products of our environment. And then at some point we need to own who we become on our own. You know, you reach a certain age and you can no longer blame your parents.
Yeah.
And I think this group has all reached that age.
What's that, Barry?
This group has all reached that age.
Yeah, I think so. I wonder if classically it's borrowed bat mitzvah age, or Felix, yes.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I think it was Rabbi Heschel who said that we might not be at fault or to blame, but we must all take responsibility to rectify a wrongdoing.
Yeah.
Excellent.
That's good. Yeah, I mean, just
go ahead.
Right. You know, especially at this point in time, there's enough access to different ideas and whatnot that there's no excuse for abject ignorance. You know, you may have been taught something by your parents, an idea or whatnot, but there's no reason that you can't go find information to see if that idea is actually true. That's something I personally have had.
So then the question becomes,
early adult is undoing.
Yeah, how do you find that balance then between continuing to honor your parents at such point that you have information that's different from what they believe, what they taught, how they raised you? This was a situation with the whole Black Lives Matter for one of my siblings, who holds opinions that I think we probably would label as racist. And it came to a head a week or so ago when the family was having a conversation, and my niece said to my brother, "Your opinions are embarrassing to me." And there was a threat of a real serious rift and estrangement in the family. And I think my mom, the matriarch, intervened a little bit to help them to agree to set aside their differences and agree to disagree, but that the family relationship still needed to remain intact. So how to honor and respect your parents when you disagree. And there are lines probably where that responsibility to honor and respect parents is abrogated, but this might not be one of them. I think people are all too quick to invoke that cutting off of the family ties rather than figuring out how to say that we each can have differences of opinion. Marcy, I think you're going to get like the last word here.
Well, I have sort of two little last words. One is my translation doesn't say fathers, it says forebears, but it's the women's commentary, so I'm not really surprised. And also, too, I forget which is which. I'm sorry, Kat and Michelle. I know you told us last week, and I forget which is which.
That was Michelle who just spoke.
Okay. To what Michelle said, and I've seen this both ways, to go and look up information, you have to recognize there's something that you need to look it up for. Like, you have to recognize there's an issue. And some people may not recognize there's even an issue to go look up. There's I think there's a song from South Pacific that talks about hate being taught.
Yes.
You have to be fully taught.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but I just want to say, in terms of what Michelle said, that's still not an excuse. It might be an explanation, but there are no excuses anymore.
All right, so we will pick up next week with verse 41, the uncircumcised heart.
Wow.
Oseh shalom b'mromav, ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Amen.
Amen.
So happy Father's Day to all the fathers. Shavua Tov to everyone. If you're on Facebook, I finished the Midah of the day on Friday, went through all 90 Midah cards that I had. So as of this morning, I've instituted the Perek of the week. So I'm going to be going through Pirkei Avot, one teaching a week. It is posted up there, and I'm interested in feedback. If it's meaningful, if the format is working, if you have any thoughts or suggestions about how I can improve that, I would be interested to know. If you have any real serious feedback, don't put it in the comments. Just send me an email. All right. Thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. Bye-bye.
Thank you.